Greg, when I want to try to discern whether God exists and whether I'm going to believe in God, and I look at some of the philosophers who are writing today, I see a bewildering storm of ideas, from feminist theology to panentheism versus pantheism and theism. How do we begin to look at this scope of trying to understand the ground of all being? Is there an organizational structure a framework that we can begin to have here?
That it's fascinating, the plurality of concepts of the divine. And sorting out these concepts is one of the exciting things about being a scholar. Now, it's important for us to realize that this kind of diversity is not new. When we think about the Greek concepts of the divine, there was a vast plurality just among the Greeks, which of course moved over into the Romans, and then we do the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. So religious pluralism is as old as religion itself.
Well, if you look at Christianity and all the different sects, they didn't become sects for a reason other than they had some difference of opinion, which today can look pretty obscure.
Oftentimes you wonder what the fuss was about. Right. Exactly. Right. So the first categorical scheme, I think, on these various approaches to thinking about the divine is to sort out the ones that are actually different concepts of God or reality versus different approaches. So you mentioned feminist theology, and there are others that are similar in structure, such as liberation theology. And these tend to be hermeneutical grids of interpretation of either a theological tradition or theological scriptures, or both. There are approaches. How do we read the text and the tradition? Mm-hmm. And normally the feminist and the liberation theologians are engaging with the Western tradition, Judeo-Christianity. But when you talk about pantheism and panentheism, and we could throw in things like deism and atheism, we're talking about different concepts of ultimate reality. So it's not so much a question of how do we interpret or how do we read, but what is the nature of reality itself? And of course, these are very different worldviews.
Right. So if we have theism with some monotheistic personal God, or deism where God created things, ran off and did something else, mm-hmm. Pantheism where basically the universe is God, or panentheism where sort of God is the universe, but then God is more than the universe. You can't exhaust God by the universe in some way. Atheism, of course, that all of this is a bunch of nonsense. So that's the broad landscape of where you are, you're saying. Right. But then these other interpretations, particularly of theism, will take a different view of that.
Exactly.
And so, for example, what are some different views, big views of theism, like feminist theology or liberation theology?
Right. So I know liberation theology tends to read the Christian scriptures with a great deal of emphasis on the liberation passages in the career of Jesus, for instance. And some liberation theologians feel that the church very quickly began to distort the original message of concern for the poor, meeting the poor's needs, that God is on the side of the poor and not on the side of the rich. And of course, there are scriptures that give that reading. And so liberation theologians are going to read these and say that the core message of Christianity is that God is on the side of the poor, so we should be on the side of the poor. And of course, there's a plurality of liberation theologians.
Just like anything else.
Just like anything else. But some are going to say that a Christian shouldn't own private property. We should advocate for socialism and things like this out of this reading of the text. Mm. Feminist theologians tend to read the text differently, with different concerns and categories in mind. And some of those strong ones are going to be on the identity of women, not just the women in the stories, but on the feminine nature of God. And some feminist theologians are going to be very concerned with the tradition of ascribing masculine pronouns, mm-hmm. but it's not really about language, masculine
personalities and personality characteristics
to the divine. Mm-hmm. And they will be very quick to point out places in the scriptures where God is a tender mother to God's children. Now, I'm not a liberation theologian or a feminist theologian, but I take both of these as challenges to make sure that I am not reading the scriptures out of the comfort of my own worldview, that I'm allowing the scriptures to challenge how I view them. This is, I think, why there can be fruitful discussion between what you might call traditional readers of the text, and I would put myself there, and feminist readers of the text and liberation readers of the text.
Does it bother you as a philosopher and a believer that there is such dramatic diversity on both sides in terms of how human beings imagine the divine, whether it exists or not, and then if it exists at all in these radically incompatible forms, and then the large number of different interpretations or hermeneutical analysis?
Well, sometimes it bothers me. Sometimes it bothers me existentially. I wish it was more simple, maybe. The vast plurality of religions can bother me sometimes. And I wish it was more simple.
But simple your way.
Or more clear, right, for anyone's way. But other times I think this is what we should expect about the human condition. Because the whole knowledge quest is fraught with difficulty. We have widely diverse theories about human psychology, about the nature of numbers. And as a philosopher, I live in disagreement. No one expects two philosophers to agree about anything. And so plurality on one hand doesn't bother me.
But scientists agree, and we know that what scientists agree upon, when they finally do agree, it has robustness and continues. We don't find that in religion. We find all this diversity. And would you think that if religion is truly grounded in the capital T, the ground of all being, that you would have such diversity and such uncertainty and such hiddenness in all this?
Well, I actually don't think that's a very strong argument for two reasons. Pause. I actually think the argument that we should not expect religious pluralism if God is real is not very strong for two reasons. And one has to do with, I think, the fact that science grows towards agreement, and I don't want to insult the scientists, has a great deal to do with science studies the easiest parts of reality, the stuff that just is there. We don't have convergence in psychology. We don't have convergence in theories of art. Philosophy doesn't have convergence because, in a sense, these disciplines, the humanities, study something vastly more complicated than photosynthesis, for example. They study the human person. So there's a moving target. There's a great deal more complexity and mystery about the object, which leads me to expect more diversity of views. So I don't believe the religious pluralist argument against the reality of God is very strong.